Since the advent of the Link era, column placement has become an integral part of Yu-Gi-Oh! It was only a matter of time before Konami started pumping out card designs based around this new facet of the game. However, not all of these column-based cards have been winners. Enter the SForce, one of the many archetypes made to capitalize on this new design space to disastrous results. The SForce are a security force led by SForce Justify, who's the deck's main boss monster. In lore, they're enemies of the Psy-Frames and the Time Thieves, criminal groups within the game's lore. As cool as that is, it doesn't really affect how the deck plays. To see what the deck's identity is, we should take a look first at the wave of support it received in Blazing Vortex, and more specifically SForce Rappa Chiyomaru, arguably the most important card in the deck. You may recognize her as the girl that became one of the most broken Link 2s ever printed. Anyways, this is a level 2 Dark Warrior with a modest 800 attack and 1000 defense. It is the effect where any monster your opponent controls in the same column as an SForce monster you control can only attack that monster. As a quick effect, you can banish an SForce card from your hand to bounce Chiyomaru back to your hand, then summon any SForce monster from your deck in defense position. This is your main playmaker, as well as an excellent demonstration of the two main gimmicks of the SForce cards. One is a series of Floodgates style effects centered around entirely columns, mainly debuffing your opponent's monsters that are in the same column as your SForce monsters. The other gimmick is banishing SForce monsters from your hand to pay for costs. The SForce monsters have a wide variety of Floodgate effects across their monsters. For example, in the first wave of support, they received SForce Gravitino, which makes it so that any monster in the same column as an SForce gets banished when it leaves the field. SForce Dogtag, which makes it so that monsters in the same column as your SForce monsters can't activate effects during your main phase. And SForce Edge Razor, which makes it so that any monster sharing a column with an SForce can't be used as a link material for a link 3 or higher monster. These column-based floodgates were the main draw of the deck, of course, but it also had a few playmakers to try and allow the deck to summon its boss monster, SForce Justify. This is a link 3 with all upward pointing arrows. It requires 3 effect monsters, one of which has to be an SForce, and has 2 effects. The first effect allows you to target and negate one effect monster your opponent controls, and then move it to a zone Justify is pointing to. The second effect allows it to banish all monsters it's pointing to whenever it attacks before damage calculation. This is, overall, a fine boss monster, with its main flaw simply being that it always requires 3 monsters to summon, so it's difficult to link climb into. The deck also has some fine spell and trap card support. Bridgehead not only has its effect to protect your monsters from battle, it also adds an SForce monster from deck to hand on activation. SForce Showdown allows you to special summon a banished SForce or add an SForce from grave to hand. SForce Chase allows you to target face-up cards your opponent controls up to the number of SForce monsters you control with different names and bounce all of them. It can also banish itself from the graveyard whenever you need to banish an SForce card from hand for one of your card effects. Finally, SForce Specimen allows you to summon an SForce monster from your grave or from your banishment to a column your opponent has a monster in. It can also be banished from grave to let you move an SForce monster from one monster zone to another. It seems like overall, the SForce were ready for action. So why did this deck fail? Well, there were a few issues. For one, the deck didn't really have much actual playmaking potential. When I said Chiyomaru was the best card of the deck, that wasn't meant as a compliment to the card's amazing potential as a starter. It's more that most of the other cards in the archetype did very little. In the first wave of support, there were only 4 monsters in the SForce with the ability to special summon themselves or other cards, and unfortunately, they weren't all that. Besides Chiyomaru, you had Dogtag, Edge Razor, and Platina. Dogtag had the effect to special summon itself from your hand when your opponent normal or special summoned a monster, which is cool but not consistent for making plays. Edge Razor allowed you to special summon any SForce from your hand when it was summoned, which is legitimately helpful. Finally, if you had Platina, you could special summon a banished SForce when it was normal or special summon. None of the other SForce monsters could special summon themselves or any other cards, and your spells and traps weren't much help. Showdown only being able to special summon banished SForce monsters is a real headache, as it can lead to a lot of awkward hands where you have an SForce in hand or in your graveyard, and you really want to get back for a play, but are completely unable to interact with. The end result is that the deck has very few hands that can summon its boss monster in turn 1, and even if you can get that far, you won't have any extension past that point. To even get to Justify in your first turn, you need to find Chiyomaru, and either Edge Razor or Showdown and another SForce monster on your first turn. You can't even use Edge Razor to summon Gravitino and then add Showdown because you won't have any way to banish an SForce monster to get back with Showdown in the first place. Generic extra deck options likely won't help either, because Justify's strict summoning requirements mean that link climbing isn't an option. Now, not being able to make your boss monster on the first turn may not be that big of a deal if your main deck monsters are capable of fending for themselves in the meantime. However, even if you don't go for Justify, you're not going to be putting up very impressive boards. And that leads into the second issue with the archetype, which is that the column-based mechanic is very easy to play around. If you look at the floodgate effects of cards like Edgerazor or Gravitino, you'll notice that they all share a very specific condition. Every single one of these effects only works on monsters in the same column as your SForce cards. This means that certain combos can play around your floodgates entirely by simply playing their cards in the other two zones. Sure, with Chiyomaru and Bridgehead combined, you can make most of your monsters immune to battle destruction by forcing all of your opponent's monsters to attack monsters Bridgehead is protecting, but that only applies if they summon their boss monster in one of those affected zones. If they manage to summon a monster large enough to beat over your monster by battle in a zone you couldn't put a monster into, you'll be hung up to dry. The spell and trap card support helps a bit, but it can't cover for this glaring weakness entirely. While Specimen can let you play around this counterplay, all it's effectively doing is allowing your cards to function properly as opposed to simply failing outright. That's also assuming you could put Specimen into the graveyard that quickly anyway, which is unlikely because it will only activate one of its effects per turn. So if you used it earlier that turn to get one of your monsters back, it won't even be on. And again, this is all assuming you're able to get 3 SForce monsters onto the field on turn 1 with the effects that your opponent would need to play around, which isn't going to be the case very often because the floodgate effects on the SForce cards are pretty awful. We've been dancing around this point for a bit, but the potential for disruption on the SForce monsters is laughably low. Remember, this was released in 2021. Around this time, decks like Virtual World and Drytron were out and very playable. Many of these floodgates are more minor annoyances and ways of disrupting your opponent. Dog Tag only stops your opponent from activating monster effects during your main phase, so your opponent can combo unimpeded. This would actually be pretty useful still if Dog Tag could be summoned during your turn easily, but for some reason its summoning condition makes it the easiest to summon during your opponent's turn when it doesn't do anything. Gravitino's banishing effect could mess with your opponent, but you either have to successfully remove your opponent's cards, or your opponent has to play them into your board poorly for it to ever come up. It's strong when you're already in a good position, or when combined with SForce Chase to turn its bounce into banishing, but that can be difficult to properly set up. SForce Orifice prevents your opponent from targeting their own monsters instead of protecting your monsters from targeting, like basically any archetype would do, which only matters in very specific situations. Funnily enough, it did have some applications against Virtual World, as their cards had to target their own cards to function, but that's the only deck around this time where this effect would even theoretically be live, and even then, it was easily played around. It also has a removal effect, which isn't awful, but that's the only value it's really providing you because the Floodgate effect will very rarely come up. Edgerazor stopping your opponent from link climbing above a link rating of 3 is potentially very strong, but you have to bet on your opponent specifically playing links. Any Synchro, Xyz, or Fusion archetype will just laugh you off completely. So as strong as this could be, it's more of a silver bullet effect than a consistent forward disruption. The worst of all of these so-called floodgates has to be SForce Professor Digama, who has the amazing effect of preventing your opponent from changing their monster's battle positions, but only if they're in the same column as an SForce monster. Could you imagine the horror if Digama's effect hit the entire board and not only the column you had already summoned a monster to? I could, because Final Attack Orders has been in the game for years and hasn't been playable in decades. It doesn't get better for SForce anytime soon though, because on top of having bad floodgate effects, the deck also has very little it can do to protect these cards in the first place. Outside of Bridgehead's awkward battle protection that can easily be played around if you don't have Chiyomaru exactly in play, the deck has basically no cards that can protect its board. This is especially bad because a lot of these monsters are actually pretty easy to just beat over in battle. The highest stat on any of these monsters is a mere 2600 on SForce Justify. Most of the others have attack and defense stats capping out at around 2200. And yeah, attack and defense stats matter very little in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, but that's usually because players are consistently summoning boss monsters with 3000 or more attack, which as we've covered, the SForce are quite bad at. This means that a lot of the so-called SForce end boards lose to a normal summon Berserk Gorilla, let alone any cards that are actually good. In fact, your entire deck has basically no answer to any interaction that comes in the form of back row. Spell and trap cards will be able to remove your cards with complete impunity, and even your boss monster is completely unable to stop them. This alone would be enough to make the deck quite bad, But there's one additional flaw of SForce that makes it a truly bad archetype. This is a strange weakness to pin down, but a big problem with SForce is that the cards just don't do anything near powerful enough to warrant trying to play them. It has some good cards. Yugioh is a good and surprisingly flexible starter, especially for a deck that can recur its monsters from banishment as easily as this deck can. SForce Justify is a good boss monster that synergizes with the deck very well. While not stellar, SForce Showdown and Chase are good back row support that you could at least play to be searched off of Gravitino. However, these are all of the best cards in the archetype, and none of them are exceptional. Worse, they're actively dragged down by the rest of the mediocre to outright bad cards that you have to play to enable them. The Floodgate effects aren't just easy to play around, they're outright weak effects. The monsters are clunky and often actively don't synergize with each other or even themselves properly. The deck is a bunch of bad cards with a few serviceable enablers sprinkled in, and this will prove to be the main problem that SForce would have going forward. And that covers this state of the SForce at the time of release and into the immediate future. However, they did get more support down the line. SForce Retroactive and SForce Lapsawell were printed in Battle of Chaos, and SForce Night Chaser was printed a year later in Cyberstorm Access. These cards are all generally strong, so let's look at them in more detail to see if they can save this failing archetype. Retroactive is a level 1 warrior with 0 attack and defense. If you would use a monster in your field to link summon an SForce Link monster, you can use it in your hand as a material. During the main phase, you can return it from your field to your hand to summon a level 2 or higher SForce monster from your hand. And if you would banish an SForce monster from your hand as a cost for an SForce effect, you can banish it from your graveyard instead. Retroactive is a great extender for the archetype, making your combos far more consistent to pull off. The other two effects allow the deck to generate far more value with its effects, as well as being even more flexible by allowing you to pivot in and out of specific monsters. Lapsawell is a level 6 with 2400 attack and 2500 defense. When special summon, it allows you to special summon an SForce monster from your graveyard, and it has the effect where, during your main phase, you can banish an SForce from your hand to destroy all monsters in the same column as your SForce monsters. This makes your game plan far more consistent. Now you can summon something off your Yugioh that reborns from the grave instead of banishment, which allows you to extend in far more situations and leads to more plays. It's also another form of removal besides Justify or Chase of the archetype, allowing you to out your opponent's board in more ways. Finally, we have Night Chaser, a frankly absurd Link 1 monster. It points straight down and requires a non-Link SForce monster to be made. It prevents your opponent's monsters from attacking any monsters in the same column as them. So if you want to make a worse dupe frog lock a decade late, you can combine this with Yugioh. However, it also has the effect where you can target one of your SForce monsters and shuffle it into the deck to special summon an SForce from your banishment. This card basically completely outmoded Platina as the deck's premier way to recur monsters from the banish zone. It's exceptionally easy to make, and even better, it can be activated as a quick effect, allowing you to accrue more value over several turns by recurring a once per turn effect during your opponent's turn without having to rely on Yugioh, because honestly, Yugioh can't be the only one doing the heavy lifting in this archetype. All around, these cards make the SForce deck far more flexible and consistent. Retroactive allows you to actually make your boss monster consistently. Lapsawell means that Justify isn't your only answers to threats your opponent summons, and Night Chaser is honestly a pretty insane Link 1 to print for any deck that wants to banish its own cards. However, none of them fix the final issue with this deck, which is that it just doesn't do anything. You still can't extend enough to make an imposing board. Your Floodgate effects are still pitifully weak and easy to play around, and you're not generating tons of card advantage or anything like that to attract players to the strategy. Fundamentally, there's just no reason to play SForce. With all of this in mind, how could we improve this strategy? Well, there are a number of decks and cards based around columns that we could look at to see where things went wrong. The first, well, many people will go to, are the Mech Knights. These are an archetype of cards with the effect where if there are 2 or more cards in the same column, you can special summon this card to that column. Additionally, multiple members of the archetype had effects that cared about what columns they were in, such as Mech Knight Red Moon, which could destroy a monster in the same column, or Mech Knight Blue Sky, which could add Mech Knights from deck to hand, equal to the number of cards your opponent controls in the same column as Blue Sky. This deck had a much easier time getting its column set up, because as long as you had any spell or traps in your hand, you could always at least set one of those in the same column as an opponent's monster, or set a spell or trap card and summon the Mech Knight that way. Another similar card is Iron Dragon Taimoton. While more niche, this is a much more powerful card that cannot be normal summoned or set, but can special summon itself as long as there are 3 more cards in a single column. When special summoned this way, it destroys all other cards in its column, and then neither player can use zones in the same column as Taimotan. This is a bit of a niche card, but when you can get it to work, it's kind of a blowout. These are at least some ideas for things that you could do to make SForce better. At least some of the SForce cards could be given summoning conditions similar to Mech Knights or Iron Dragon. Maybe they could summon themselves to a column with a monster your opponent controls with certain characteristics, high enough level, high enough attack points, or maybe a monster special summon from the extra deck. This could give the deck far more extension. Another idea is to make the SForce effects more proactive. SForce all being based around Floodgates mean that, if you're going second and can't make SForce Justify or SForce Lapiswell, you can't out your opponent's board. Considering that the deck already has a theme of summoning cards on your opponent's turn with Retroactive and Shiomaru, SForce cards that destroy cards in their column or negate the effects of cards in their column on their summon could be extremely powerful in the archetype. Another direction you could take is based around how they like banishing their own cards. The Molasses archetype is based around banishing their own cards, and while we shouldn't push this deck as hard as that deck was, considering how strong Molasses has been, some of the designs could be transferred over to SForce successfully. Cards like Molasses in the Mirror have an effect that triggers when they're banished. In this case, to banish another Molasses card from your graveyard, that can add a Molasses card of the same type from deck to hand. Most of their monsters also have an effect to summon themselves from banishment. This makes the deck far more powerful, though it may be a bit too good of an effect to slap onto your cards. Not to mention, this archetype has cards like Night Chaser that summon your banished monsters already, so it would be really weird to give the deck new cards that don't actually work with the best cards currently in the archetype. The Molasses in the Mirror example would be more at home in an SForce deck. The final way you can make the deck better is also one that people would probably enjoy the least, and that's to make the Floodgates on the SForce monster stronger. Even if it's difficult to summon them out, if getting a board of 4 SForce monsters actually prevented your opponent from making powerful plays, the deck would be a lot stronger. Of course, the last time we had a Floodgate-based archetype be good was Kashtira, and that deck locked 9 of your opponent's zones and then made a Macrocosmos, which led to the Yugioh community being somewhat upset, to put things mildly. So this probably isn't the best idea. This would also be a nightmare to balance, because if you stick to the column-based gimmick, it would still be really hard to balance. More likely than not, your opponent would either be able to just completely ignore the restrictions, or would be completely unable to play around them, leading to pretty awful games. This is an on-theme way of making the SForce better, but it's probably not the best idea either when other, better avenues are available. So the SForce are a series of cards that are, overall, far too weak. Their main gimmicks are inherently difficult to make work, as your opponent will always have far too much counterplay, as they control where they summon their monsters, not you. On top of that, they had very few good cards in the archetype that were only good and not exceptional. Overall, the deck did far less than the competition for far more work. Later support increased the deck's consistency and power dramatically, but it didn't raise the ceiling of the deck's power enough to make it more viable. There are several other avenues that Konami could go down for making new support, but without them printing enough new main deck cards to essentially replace most of the main deck monsters, it probably won't be enough to save this failing archetype.